Hello everybody, my name is Adam Gressick. I'm a park ranger here at Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial. This was the home of Robert E. Lee from 1831 to 1861. However, it goes back to 1802. It's built by a man named George Washington Parke Custis, grandson of Martha Washington, step-grandson to the George Washington. He builds this home here after inheriting this land from his grandmother Martha to house his Washington treasury and to serve as a memorial to his adopted grandfather. See, Mr. Custis, well, he grew up at Mount Vernon. He adored our first president, was actually one of the first presidential children. And after his grandparents pass away, he hoped to inherit Mount Vernon, George Washington's place, but he ends up actually kind of getting shut out of there. So he buys all of George Washington's stuff. Actually, they have an estate sale at Mount Vernon, if you can believe that. And he spends most of his fortune buying all of George's stuff. Everything from battle tents, swords, flags, furniture, silverware, china, everything. He blows his entire fortune, has it all in a little cabin down near the river. Well, stuff starts to molder. He needs a nice big house, so he starts building here in 1802. The first section he builds is actually the north wing right over there. As soon as he gets enough money to build the south wing, he builds that in 1804. And then while the center section, it's the largest, it needed a good bit of money, so he builds it between 1816 and 1818. Now, with all that George Washington stuff he bought, he ended up blowing his fortune, had to build a house in sections. He also had to kind of skimp on construction, and that's something that's not initially obvious about the house. It looks from here like we have this beautiful limestone facade and then marble up top. Well, it's all fake. Builds the house out of brick because that was what was locally available, as well as timber that was here on the property. He covers it over in stucco and then paints it to look like stone. Because his intent was, well, I just don't want a house to live in. I need a memorial to George Washington, to my adopted grandfather. And also this site he picks overlooking the then brand new capital city. He wanted to make sure everybody living down there, from the president, all the members of Congress, to the guys sweeping the streets, that they'd have a view of his house so they'd be able to see his grandfather's legacy. Now, Robert E. Lee comes into the picture in 1831. He actually meets Mr. Custis's daughter a little bit before that, about 1809, 1810 or so, when he's a toddler playing here, visiting some of his relatives. After he graduates from West Point in 1829, Robert E. Lee then proposes to Mary Anna Randolph Custis, Mr. Custis's daughter. He goes off to his first duty station in Georgia, comes back here, and then in 1831, he marries Mary Anna Randolph Custis under the center archway of the dining room. So Robert E. Lee gets married in his father-in-law's house, then moves in that evening. And that starts sort of the Lee family tenure here. Now, Robert E. Lee wasn't at the house constantly. He was with the Army, stationed all over the country. But whenever he was on leave, whenever he was stationed in the Washington area, this was his home. And it was very much his residence. He had 7 children, 6 of whom were born here. All 7 of them were raised here. There's stories of him walking in the rose garden, gathering roses for his daughters, teaching his sons how to fish, how to swim in the Potomac. So whenever he could be here and be a family man, he was. Now, with the onset of the Civil War, that Lee tenure starts to come to an end. Robert E. Lee, by this point, had been in the U.S. Army for close to 32 years. He was one of America's most accomplished officers. He was decorated for bravery during the War with Mexico in the 1840s. And with the onset of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was raising 75,000 men to invade the then fledgling Confederacy. Lincoln wanted one of America's best officers to command that force. That man was Robert E. Lee.